So if I was to compare the two, because our undergraduate education was so loose in the sense that, we didn't have this kind of really structured education or structured, mentoring that you have today, we were left to our own devices. So we had to figure out what books to read, who to talk to, so many of us would make a yearly trip to Ahmedabad. We would raid the library, bring back Xerox copies of all these books that people had recommended. And we were in a way on our own, trying to find, we had a few teachers, of course, Mr. Dubey, who was, teaching, who was also teaching at that time, and Dinesh Verma, another great teacher. But other than that, we were more or less trying to figure this stuff ourselves, figure this stuff out ourselves. And MIT was exactly like that as well. So we had, I think, around 9 credits, compulsory credits at MIT out of the 96 or something that you had to accumulate. And so the rest of those credits, whatever 85 credits, were completely up to you to decide what you would do over 4 years or over 2 years. And so you would sit with your advisor and figure out you could register at Harvard. I mean, it was a complete, choice of what you would do. So uh, that's one part of it. So the ability to sort of structure your own education and to get all of the information that you think you need to move forward, and that maturity, thanks to BMS, I had some of that, and some of our friends as well. The second thing, and which is very different from BMS to MIT, was just the caliber of the teachers that we had at MIT, and the caliber of your peers. Because a lot of the students who had come for graduate education were probably some of the best students from around the world, and so you were in this environment which was so sort of, it was like sizzling with this intellectual energy, and so that in itself, I mean, even if you didn't have the teachers and you just were spending time with colleagues, who were from all parts of the world. And so people who come to the office and ask me, is it worth it, spending all of this money to go abroad? And I say, if you can afford to do it, to go abroad to study, it's a fantastic thing to do, because it forces you to define who you are, in the context of the world. It sort of forces you to say, these are the things that form my identity and form my voice. And so going out actually, in a way, brings you back home. It's a journey into your own sort of self and your own identity. So it's a really nice, if you can afford it. The other alternative, of course, if you had the money, was to travel, because travel does the same thing. It puts you out into these environments which are foreign, and so then it forces you to confront who you are really. So that's so yeah, MIT was fantastic in that sense. I mean, just a complete sort of shake up. Yeah. But yeah, I don't think it's easy to generalize. There are some students who I think benefit from working for a bit before going for their masters, because they may not be sure what to pursue for their master's degree. And it's important for you to articulate that, because most of the master's programs are pretty loosely structured, and so you could come out of a master's program without a real comprehensive understanding of anything. It may be a mishmash of various things. And so I think it's important for you to have an idea of what it is you want to focus on for your masters and write a thesis about. And that some kids are, they're precocious, they understand, they mature before their time, and so they're able to decide very quickly what it is they want to focus on. But there are other students who would do well to work for a bit, and so I don't think I'd generalize. I think if you know a student over a period of time, you can kind of suggest whether it's worth it to go for a master's. If it's a lot of money, it's a huge investment. Most probably that investment's not going to bear any fruit, because like you asked about, whether the MIT education has any physical, is there a return on investment? That what I've learned there, I've learned of abstract ideas which are useful, but specific tools, India is a completely different sort of environment. And so we may not be able to use those specific tools here to some extent, but it gives you this, I don't know, it gives you this worldview, which I think is quite useful. And it also humbles you when you go. I mean, a lot of us go there thinking, we are cat's whiskers and that we're really good, and, we got into these big institutions. But the moment you meet the others and you meet your teachers, it completely levels it out for you. The ground is sort of gone from under your feet, and then you're back to sort of just floundering. And that's a good place to be always, to sort of not be completely sure of things. Yeah. So if you have the money and if you have the wherewithal to do it, I'd say it's a good thing to do. But it isn't essential. I mean, there are lots of friends of mine who run wonderful practices, who are thinking practitioners, who haven't ever gone for a master's. So it isn't a must. Yeah. Well, I think the biggest challenge that one faces when, at least for me, faces one when transitioning from being a student to being in professional life is the notion of collaboration and what it means to work with many people together to do something. Unfortunately, especially undergraduate education is focused so singularly on the genius, on the master creator, on this incredible, like all of our projects, I think for undergrad up until maybe even the 8th semester, you're doing individual projects. You're forced to articulate a fantastic idea or a concept for a project coming completely from you. There's so much of emphasis put on this notion of the genius, that this is how an architect operates, this one person coming up with a beautiful idea. And the moment you come out from architecture school and you start working, you realize that that's not true at all. And that the great idea actually comes through consensus and through negotiation and through these conversations that you have with many people. There's a wonderful book on the Dominican Mother House. It's a project that Louis Kahn designed in the 1960s. It was never built. He spent 2 years sort of developing the plans for it. But even a great architect like Kahn is negotiating through the process of coming to that beautiful plan at the end of that whole process. It isn't Kahn coming up with the ideas himself. It's him negotiating with the budget, with the mothers, with his own people in the office, and coming to something as something that is shared as a consensual result. So I think that's the big difference between how we're taught and the real world. Yeah, just to clarify, I didn't actually work with Doshi. I worked in his office with Rajiv Katpalia. We were doing some Reliance housing, and Doshi would be downstairs. We were sitting upstairs, and Doshi's office downstairs was handling the Diamond Bourse at that time. So we would go, of course, once in a while to attend some of the design discussions and see Doshi operating. And he's got a very, very sort of intuitive way of working. I mean, it isn't formalistic. It isn't in a way, it is not a very structured approach. It's almost like playing jazz, so it's him and the architect and the model maker, and they're all sort of riffing off of each other, and the thing is sort of coming to some shape as a result of this kind of cross conversation. When later on, when we made the film on Doshi, that's when I really got to know Doshi a lot more closely than when I was working at his office. So the big lesson about him is his ability to sort of just his humanity, I think, is the big lesson. His ability to connect to people, to absorb all kinds of information and try to sort of see meaning in that. He doesn't come to things with any kind of preconceived idea. He's open in a very, very true way, which a lot of us aren't. And so he's just always open to receive any kind of stimulus, and then is willing to engage, and willing to sort of riff off of that, which is a fantastic ability for a creative person, because then you have no pressure. You're not waiting for the idea to come from you. You're waiting for the world to come to you with ideas, and then you sort of rifle through that to come to
Right.
It is a fantastic way to operate in the world. Just being completely engaged. So that, I think, is a fantastic lesson for a creative person.
Thank you.
So I think maybe I should clarify that there are two. So there's a great essay, I think 1961. I think Louis Kahn wrote an essay called Form and Design, and he made this distinction between form and design as form being something that is before the site, before context, before climate, before anything. It's kind of this nebulous idea for a project, the nature of things. He asks about the nature of a school or the nature of this monastery that he was designing. And this question of the nature of things is actually much before context. And it is a different kind of context. It's this kind of philosophical idea. What is it to be in a certain kind of space to do certain kinds of things. So that's one part of it, and we really believe that it's important to articulate what that sort of nebulous thing is, that sort of really philosophical idea for a project. And the second thing about context is the notion of design, the notion that what does circumstance bring to the table? The circumstance in the sense, what's the site bringing to the table, the client, the climate, the contractor, all of those circumstantial components which make the project. So marrying these two is how probably Khan was thinking that architecture gets formed, this relationship between form and design, or between tradition in that philosophical sense and circumstance. And so that, for us, context actually is all of that. It isn't only about the specific conditions of the site, but it's also the philosophical conditions of the project. What is a school? What is a public building? What is an institution? What is a home? You're asking that question without having all of these sort of specific things in mind. It's a bit difficult, but that's the struggle. I mean, all of us are trying to search for that ideal, and in every project we're trying to bring to bear that ideal imagination that we have. I struggle a little bit with the idea, and when we were doing that DY Patil trophy, this was the question of the trophy. Is there something like Indianness? What is Indianness, and how do you define that? And I don't think it's something that you can come to in terms of a general statement. I think it's about locality. It's about the particular condition in which you're operating. So I kind of shy away from this kind of grand narrative of an Indian architecture or Indian identity. I think it's a lots of bits and pieces sort of coming together to form that whole. And so if I was to get a project and the project is located in a particular place, having dealt with the philosophical sort of conditions of that project, I also want to look very carefully at that particular location, because that's identity for me. Being really rooted in a particular place, in a particular culture. And that, I mean, India isn't one thing, India is many things together, and it is in that sort of collage or in that melange that you find the value. So I would shy away from the notion of a sort of grand overarching idea of what Indianness is. The central vista is low hanging fruit. It's easy pickings. It's a disaster. I mean, it's just clearly a really poorly thought out project. I mean, just in its conception. I wouldn't blame the architect. I think the person who wrote out this ambition to do this incredibly stupid development has to be blamed. All of the government entities who are thinking up this crazy idea to redevelop Central Vista, and in such a way. I mean, it at every level, it sort of is exactly the opposite of what. This is the heart of our urban consciousness. As Prem Chandavar calls it, the epicenter of our urban consciousness. This stretch between Raj Bhavan and the India Gate, and so. If ever there was anything that you wanted to do with that space, was to make it more public, to make it more accessible, to make it more of that epicenter. And in fact, this project goes exactly in the opposite direction by making it more private, or more government, more surveillance, more control. And so just at that fundamental level, I think there is a problem. And then in the light of all of the troubles that we're facing currently, to say that we would spend 20,000 crores on a project of this kind in the capital of the country, when we've only set aside 15,000 crores for the whole of the country to fight, this disaster. I mean, just the conceptually, that's it just shows where our priorities are, in terms of just megalomania and the idea of, just showing physically the power of the central government.